Hello everyone. Today we are going to begin a series of lectures on the Medieval Crusades. You'll notice I've titled this Holy War. You may think this is a term that is used only by Islam, but not so. From the very beginning of the union of church and state, once Rome united with the church, all of Rome's wars became holy wars. Of course, the idea is that God is on our side, right? But I want to emphasize that all wars are political because they involve people, property, and power. Wars can be offensive or defensive or both. But as well as being political, almost all wars are religious in nature because remember, nations used religion as cement to hold their empire together, to unite their soldiers and their supporters back home in one worthy goal. And so the Crusades were religious wars on both sides, but we don't want to overlook the political nature of the Crusades either, as they pit people against each other for the sake of gaining property and power. Let's discuss a definition of the medieval Crusades. All right, the Crusades were a series of expeditions from Western Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean, beginning in 1095. They were designed to recover the Holy Land from Islam and then to retain it in Christian hands. Now, historians have determined 8 major crusades from 1095 to 1291. However, there were also the Children's Crusade, and then back home, the crusading spirit was used to send attacks against heretics in Western Europe. And besides this, the crusading spirit was constant. And so it rose and fell in waves throughout these 2 centuries. And so it was these high points when the waves spiked that we have a crusade that might be worthy of a historic number. And then also, Crusades didn't end in 1291. 1291 is the date when the Crusaders were expelled from the Holy Land, but many Crusaders regrouped on the island of Cyprus and continued to make forays into the Holy Land. But for all intents and purposes, the Crusades ended in 1291, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. There were a number of motivations for the Crusades. By 1095, Muslims had conquered about 2/3 of the territory that had been traditionally part of Christendom. The last time we discussed the advance of Islam, they had crossed over the North Africa and invaded Spain. Now you'll see from this map that the established church had advanced back onto Spain and regained some of that territory. But notice in the east that they've gone further north, and the Muslims have captured all of what we call Turkey. They're literally knocking on the door of Constantinople, so threatening the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, and of course beyond that is Europe. And so they were threatening Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, and the Eastern Empire. And so the West was vulnerable to the Muslim invasion. And so the hope was that by bolstering the defenses in the Byzantine Empire, that the Crusaders could protect themselves from the Muslims' relenting progress. And so we want to be sure that we are aware that the Muslim aggression preceded the Crusades. And it was the Muslim aggression that instigated the Crusades, not the Westerners. Not that the Westerners are without fault, but the Crusades would not have happened without the threatening aggression of the Muslim invasion. At the same time, many knights and peasants were eager for wealth and adventure. You'll remember that in the feudal system, at the very bottom of the pyramid are the knights, and below them are the serfs. All right, they had very little opportunity for advancement and adventure, and so they thought that the Crusades would be one way to achieve some of their personal goals. All right, the Muslims, of course, had conquered the Holy Land. And when they entered Jerusalem, they found the Temple Mount was vacant, was barren. We've talked about this before. Even though the Christian Byzantine Empire had authority over the Temple Mount, they did not rebuild there because of Jesus' prophecy that no stone would stand on another. And so the Muslims drew upon Islamic legend that Muhammad himself had flown on his horse from Mecca to Jerusalem on his way up to speak to Allah. And so on the Temple Mount, they built the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. All right, the rock being the Rock of Moriah, where the Ark had rested. All right, we've been through this, so I will pass over it quickly. But nonetheless, the Crusaders wished very much to regain the Temple Mount, this place that was so holy to Judaism and Christianity. And not only was the Temple Mount a special place, but also there were other holy sites throughout the Holy Land. Pilgrimages to the Holy Land had been heightened after the year 1000 had failed to bring Christ's return. Some of you may remember, or at least read about, the year 2000, Y2K, and the expectation that Christ would return, or at least that there would be some kind of electronic apocalypse that was supposed to take place. But when the year 1000 came and went and failed to bring Christ's return, many of the disappointed Christians felt that pilgrimages were necessary as means of acquiring merit. And yet these pilgrimages to the Holy Land were thwarted by the Muslims. They increased hardships on the pilgrims, threatening them, robbing them, even murdering them. The Muslims destroyed the shrines in Jerusalem and throughout the Holy Land. And so the Crusades were fueled by a desire to reclaim the Holy Land, and this desire was heightened by the desire for pilgrimages during the century of 1000. Finally, the Eastern Emperor asked for help from Pope Urban II. The Seljuk Turks threatened the Byzantine Empire, and thus threatening also the eastern half of the Western Empire. And Urban saw a chance to reunite Christendom. Remember, the Great Schism occurred only 40 years earlier in 1054, and so he felt like this would be an opportunity to reunite the divided church. And so Urban called the Council of Clermont in 1095, November of that year. His goals were to reform the church. Remember, he is the last of the Gregorian reformers. He wanted to support the Eastern Christians against the Turks, and he wanted to liberate Jerusalem. His promises were indulgences for all who took up the cross, if they were successful or if they died in the crusade. Let's talk about what he means. First of all, the word crusade has as its root the Latin word crux, meaning cross. All right, so to go on a crusade is to take up the cross of Christ in defense of our Lord and Savior, and in an attempt to regain the Holy Land where the cross is. All right, so a crusade is an attempt to take up the cross and regain the Holy Land. All right, he promised indulgences to those who would take up the cross. If they were successful or if they died, they could receive a plenary or a full indulgence. What does that mean? That means that they would bypass purgatory and enter straight into heaven. All right, this would give them all the merit that they needed in order to achieve heaven. Now, why do you think Pope Urban had this authority? Because he was the Bishop of Rome with the keys of the kingdom. By this time, the doctrine of the treasury of merit was well advanced. The idea that saints, those who lived exemplary lives, and martyrs as well, when they died, they had earned more than enough merit to get into heaven. And so this extra merit then was set aside and stored in the treasury of merit. The Pope had the keys of the kingdom. The Pope could unlock the treasury of merit, open it up, and share that merit with whomever he chose. In this case, he promised to give that extra merit to those who took up the cross and went on a crusade. Okay, now this idea of indulgences developed from the Crusades into something far more corrupt. Along the way, some wealthy people decided that they were not able to actually take up the cross and go themselves on a crusade, but they were willing to finance someone to go in their place. And so for financing a crusade, the Pope would promise the person with the money the opportunity to gain the merit that would provide a plenary indulgence. Eventually, the Pope decided just to eliminate the middleman, forget about the crusade, and then he would tell to the wealthy man, if you give me money, I will give you an indulgence. And so we begin to see the trade in indulgences. And these abuses are going to lead to the Reformation as the Pope and his Archbishop Albert take indulgences too far. Martin Luther then stands up against them and begins a reform movement. All right, but this is where it begins. All right, it begins with the idea that the Pope can grant an indulgence to anyone who takes up the cross to go on a crusade. Now, another promise made by the Pope was the protection of Peter, Paul, and the church for estates left behind. Remember, this is during the feudal age when wealth is tied up in one's land and property. And so the Pope is asking these nobility to leave their land and go to the east. Well, what about their property? What if it's stolen and occupied? Well, the Pope promised the protection of Peter and Paul, that anyone who attempts to steal land would be excommunicated. All right, as we're going to see, this was not much of a promise, and it was not maintained throughout all the situations. All right, but the Council of Clermont, Urban promises indulgences, and he promises the protection of Peter. He calls on the knights to liberate Jerusalem, to support their eastern brothers, and this will bring a great reform to the church. And so, at the conclusion of the Council of Clermont, the council cried, Deus vult, God wills it. Okay, and so, yes, God wills it. They all cried in unison and in support of this call to take up the cross and go on a crusade. And so 1095, they head out in that direction. Now, Pope Urban had been speaking to the nobility, the dukes, the knights, and so on. But there were peasants who wanted to participate as well, and they gathered together under the leadership of Peter the Hermit, and he led a mob heading to Jerusalem. And along the way, since they were not so well supplied, they pillaged the countryside, stealing from the people who lived there. And along the way, they also slaughtered Jews. They decided, why are we traveling thousands of miles to slay the infidel? We have infidel right here. And so they slaughtered Jews in their European communities. Along the way, many of these peasants died from plague and famine. As many as 600,000 began, but only 40,000 reached the Holy Land. So this People's Crusade under Peter's leadership was a failure. The formal crusade arrived at Constantine, and they allied with the Byzantine army, and they were quite successful at first. They captured Nicaea easily, and then they captured Antioch after a long siege. But they heard the news that a large Muslim army was approaching Antioch, and they feared that they were not sufficient to defend themselves against this Muslim force. Peter Bartholomew was a priest who claimed that he had heard from St. Andrew the Apostle himself. And Andrew had revealed that in Antioch, the Holy Lance was hidden. And that if they could recover the Holy Lance, then they would have a talisman that would protect them. All right, what is the Holy Lance? The Holy Lance is also known as the Spear of Destiny. It is one of the most important Christian relics of the Passion of Jesus Christ. It's described in the Gospel of John, chapter 19, that a spear was used by a Roman soldier. Later, legend gave this soldier the name Longinus. Longinus pierced the side of Christ as he hung on the cross. The spear, bathed in the blood of the Lamb, played a significant role in the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, and it's believed that it gained a tremendous mystical power. All right, the first sign of that power was the purported healing of Longinus' failing eyesight by the blood from the wound. And this soldier later became an early convert to Christianity and eventually was beatified as Saint Longinus. Now, the spear subsequently passed through a multitude of hands, coming into the possession of many of Europe's most important political and military leaders, including Constantine himself, Charles Martel and Charlemagne, Frederick of Barbarossa, who will play a role in the Second Crusade, and other major military figures. The legend was that they were undefeated in battle as long as they possessed the spear, but once it fell from their hands, they would be defeated. The legend arose that whoever claimed the spear holds the destiny of the world in his hands for good or evil. Well, speaking of evil, let's fast forward to the 20th century, and one of the men with the most evil reputation in history is Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler, as a young man, went to a museum in Vienna, Austria, and he saw a display with the Spear of Destiny in it, and he coveted it. And once he became the Führer of Germany, he sent his soldiers to Vienna to claim the spear for Hitler. They placed it in his vault. Now, on October 12th, 1938 is the day that Hitler claimed the Spear of Destiny, and it remained in St. Catherine's Church in Nuremberg until 1944. Then it was removed to a vault beneath the church, but on April 30th, 1945, Allied troops took possession of the vault. They took possession of the spear within, and it was less than 2 hours later that Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker in Berlin. All right, so like the spear's previous owners, Hitler perished after the relic was taken from him. So you can see the historic nature, the legend that was wrapped around the Spear of Destiny, the Holy Lance. And so back to the Crusaders who were ensconced in the fort at Antioch, they also realized that this Holy Lance would be a powerful talisman against the foes who were advancing. But the Holy Lance was hidden, and so they began digging, trench after trench, seeking after the Holy Lance, not to be found until Peter Bartholomew himself looked into the trench. He jumped in, and then he came out with the Holy Lance. Okay, I don't think he sounded like a sand person, but nonetheless, he held it up high and waved it about and encouraged everyone. They had located the lance. All right, he actually just located his own spear, but nonetheless, it rallied the troops, and so the Crusaders were encouraged, and they defeated the larger Muslim army. All right, so much for the legend of the Spear of Destiny. All right, June 12th, 1099, the Crusaders see Jerusalem for the first time. Out of nowhere comes a hermit who prophesies that if you attack tomorrow, the Lord will deliver it to you. Well, that seemed a bit strange because they did not have enough ladders and they couldn't scale the walls, and yet they believed the hermit that God would miraculously deliver them if indeed they were brave enough to attempt it. But because they did not have enough ladders, they could not scale the walls. Ultimately, they had to withdraw. They were defeated. So they began a long siege of Jerusalem. The Muslims inside Jerusalem were well supplied with food and water, but the Crusaders had little water. In fact, the Muslims, in preparation for the siege, they had crept out and poisoned the wells that were outside the walls of Jerusalem. And so the Crusaders needed water and siege equipment, and so they had to scour the area for wood, for building, mobile towers, scaling ladders, catapults, and trying to find water. And let me tell you, around Jerusalem, there's not a lot of wood. Maybe the Crusaders cut it all down, but nonetheless, it's a very arid area. They had to transport water and wood over long distances until finally a supply ship arrived in Jaffa. Now, in the meantime, the Crusaders began feuding. They suffered and many deserted. Many of them died until a priest reported the vision of the dead Bishop Adhemar. Bishop Adhemar had been a leader of the crusade, but had died early on in the journey. But the spirit of the Bishop Adhemar appeared to a priest and said, "Purge your sins, march barefoot around Jerusalem, fast, and then attack on the 9th day." So this seemed much like the Lord's orders to Jericho, and so they indeed marched barefoot around Jerusalem. They ended at Mount Olivet, and the feuding princes embraced each other. So finally, the siege equipment was built. Weapons were prepared. The battle began on July 13th. 2 more days. Weary Crusaders considered withdrawing. So difficult. Jerusalem was indeed one of the best fortified cities in the Middle East. But at the last, they looked up on top of the Mount of Olives, and they saw a knight waving his shield to encourage them. Was this one of their own who had scaled the mount to reignite their spirit, or was this an angel appearing to them? We don't know, but nonetheless, they were encouraged, they took heart, they attacked one more time. This time, burning arrows found purchase in wood in the inside of the walls, caught the wall on fire, and then they could use their siege towers to go up to the wall, and then they scaled the wall, entered into the city, opened the gates. The governor surrendered. Jerusalem was sacked and Muslims were slaughtered. It is said that blood flowed through the streets of Jerusalem up to the flanks of the horses. Godfrey of Bouillon, who was the noble leader of the crusade, was named protector of the Holy Sepulchre. He would not accept the title King of Jerusalem because that belonged to Christ alone. However, after his death, Baldwin I gladly took the title King of Jerusalem. So, the First Crusade ended in somewhat of success. They had regained the Holy Land. They'd regained the Holy City, Jerusalem, and this illustration is an exaggeration because certainly they did not find the cross intact. But nonetheless, this illustration symbolizes their joy and their feeling of success at the conclusion of the First Crusade. We also feel some joy at having arrived at this point in the lecture because we've talked about many of the issues dealing with the Crusades, the motivations, the hardships, the limited success, and the temporary regaining of the Holy Land and the Holy City. But this is just the First Crusade. There will be many more Crusades to come. But we're going to pause right here, take a break, and then we'll come back and look through and survey some of the other Crusades that took place during this era. All right, I hope that you are learning and enjoying our study of the Crusades.